Welcome back. How long have you been watching my channel? Let me know below.
They threw my brother a giant BBQ, Dad's proudest day. Me? I packed my car in silence and drove away at dawn. The smell of smoked ribs and cheap beer was thick in the backyard, clinging to everything like a reminder I wasn't meant to forget. My dad was red-faced and beaming, already on his third beer by noon, talking everyone's ear off about how Mike, my older brother, finally did something real with his life by getting his CDL. Mom made her usual baked mac and cheese, the kind that always burned on the edges and never had enough salt. But everyone ate it up like it was the last meal they'd ever get. I stood on the deck with a plastic cup of lemonade, staring down at a sea of relatives who hadn't called me in months, but somehow all made time to show up and scream congratulations to Mike like he'd won a Nobel Prize. They even bought him a custom cake, a giant 18-wheeler made out of fondant and frosting with "Congrats, Trucker Mike" in red cursive. I watched them pose for pictures next to it, all grinning like he'd solved world hunger. Nobody noticed I was even there. A week before that party, I got a letter saying I'd been accepted into a state university with a decent scholarship. Still had to cover housing and books, but it was something. I brought it up at dinner, handed my mom the letter, expecting at least a nod of approval. She barely glanced at it before pushing it back to me with a sigh and a casual, "Honey, maybe you should just get a job instead of wasting money on college. Mike's got the right idea, you know. Something steady, something real." Dad didn't even look up from his meatloaf, just grunted something about debt and degrees that didn't mean anything unless you were a lawyer or a doctor, and then asked if I'd taken the trash out. So I shut up and smiled and nodded like I always did, then waited until the noise of Mike's celebration drowned everything out. I packed my car at 4 a.m. the day after the party. No fanfare, no goodbyes, just silence and the dull clink of boxes being stacked in the back of my old Honda. I left a note on the kitchen table that just said, "I'll be fine, don't wait up." Not that they would have anyway. The drive out of my hometown was weirdly calm. I thought I'd cry or feel something, but there was just this numbness, like I'd been holding my breath for years, and finally exhaled. The sun came up behind me, lighting up the cracked rearview mirror and the old graduation tassel I'd hung there 2 years ago, back when I thought things might turn out differently. I got a voicemail around mile 90, just my dad's voice, gruff and short. "Be careful out there. No, we're proud of you. No, call us when you get there." Just that. I didn't delete it. When I pulled into the tiny off-campus apartment I'd rented, sight unseen, I had exactly $312 in my bank account, a cheap air mattress in the trunk, and a whole lot of questions about whether I'd made the dumbest mistake of my life. The place was smaller than I expected, smelled faintly of mildew and someone else's broken dreams, and the window had a crack that whistled when the wind hit it just right. Still, it was mine. I started classes the following Monday. First thing I noticed was how young everyone looked. Fresh out of high school, still clinging to their Letterman jackets and Snapchat filters like the world hadn't hit them yet. I was older by only a few years, but those years felt like lifetimes. I was already working the night shift at a local diner to make rent, dragging myself home around 3 a.m. with grease in my hair and my shoes soaked in coffee. Nobody told me how hard it would be to sit through lectures on biology and American history after 5 hours of sleep and no breakfast. I got a D on my first math quiz, thought about quitting right then and there. The professor, a skinny guy with a beard that screamed tenure and a name I still can't pronounce, handed it back with a red circle around every mistake. No feedback, just a comment scrawled at the top, "Come to office hours." I didn't go. Instead, I came home that night and called Mike. He didn't pick up. I scrolled through his latest posts. Him standing next to his truck in sunglasses, captioned, "Living the dream," hundreds of likes. Mom commented, "So proud of you, sweetie." My name never came up, hasn't in months. I started eating dinner on the floor of my apartment, balancing paper plates on my knees, reading textbooks with highlighters that dried out halfway through a chapter. Sometimes I'd forget to turn off the stove. Sometimes I'd just sit and stare at the wall for an hour, wondering if they'd even notice if I never came back. Then one night, I walked past the mirror in the hallway and barely recognized myself. Dark circles under my eyes, hair tied up in a bun I hadn't washed in 3 days, a hoodie 2 sizes too big. But there was something else, something in my expression I hadn't seen before. I looked determined, not hopeful, not happy, but sure. I wasn't going back. I didn't need a party, I didn't need a cake with my face on it or a Facebook post declaring how proud my family was. What I needed was time, and maybe, just maybe, a shot at proving every single one of them wrong. The only thing I hadn't figured out yet was how. That question kept me up most nights. That and the thought of walking across a stage one day, diploma in hand, scanning the crowd, and knowing they had no idea what it took to get there. No idea what they'd thrown away. Just the sound of my name echoing through a microphone they never thought I'd deserve. The first thing I noticed when I opened the door to my apartment after that 12-hour drive was the distinct smell of something old, like dust, wet carpet, and stale cigarettes, all wrapped into one faint but persistent reminder that I was far from anything familiar, far from anything comfortable or reassuring. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, the ceiling fan wobbled with every lazy rotation, like it might just give up and fall, and the kitchen light flickered with a buzzing sound that reminded me of the bug zapper we used to have in the backyard. Except here, it wasn't catching anything, just buzzing endlessly like it was mocking the silence of the place I now called home. I stood there for a while, my suitcase still in hand, my keys dangling from the door, and I thought about what Mom would have said if she saw it. Probably something like, "Well, at least it has walls." She would have laughed, and Dad would have grunted and turned on the TV, but there was no TV here. Just me and 4 walls and a floor that creaked louder than my confidence. Classes started that Monday, and I barely had time to process the fact that I was now officially a college student. I'd picked up a job at a local diner 2 blocks from my building, working from 5 in the evening to 1 in the morning, washing dishes, mopping floors, and trying to pretend I didn't hear the cooks arguing in Spanish about how slow I was. The manager, a wiry guy named Ron, who looked like he hadn't slept in years, gave me a locker, a name tag, and a rundown of the rules, most of which boiled down to don't be late and don't talk back. I nodded through it all, too tired to argue, too scared to do anything but nod. I started that same night. Every morning, I'd stumble out of bed at 7:30, groggy and sore, my hands smelling of bleach and coffee grounds, and drag myself to campus, where I'd sit in lecture halls with kids who wore designer backpacks and had parents sending them Venmo transfers for lattes and textbooks. I overheard them talking about spring break plans in Cancun and how their dads got them internships, just in case, while I tried to make a single notebook last through 4 classes and wondered if I could afford peanut butter after rent. Nobody looked at me twice, and that was fine. I was too busy trying to keep my eyes open during chemistry lectures and praying I wouldn't get called on in history class when I hadn't had time to do the reading. I felt like an imposter, like any minute someone was going to point at me and say, "You don't belong here," and I wouldn't even be able to argue back because deep down, I was starting to believe it. The breaking point came in math. College algebra, a class I thought would be easy, turned into a weekly slap in the face. I failed the first quiz, not just barely failed, bombed it. Red ink everywhere, numbers circled with question marks beside them, like the professor was personally offended by how wrong I was. When he handed it back, he gave me this look, not cruel, not smug, but tired, like he'd seen this 100 times before. "Office hours are on the syllabus," he said, and moved on to the next student without waiting for a response. I stared at that paper for hours that night, sitting cross-legged on the floor of my apartment with a single flickering lamp and a bowl of instant noodles gone cold beside me. I didn't cry. I just sat there, numb, wondering if they'd been right. If I should have just stayed home, gotten a job, married someone local, and called it a life. But then something strange happened the next day at the diner. A customer, a woman probably in her 40s, with tired eyes and a kind smile, came in alone, sat at the counter, and ordered a grilled cheese and coffee. She asked my name. I told her. She said it like it meant something, then asked what I did besides work there. I told her I was in school. Her eyes lit up. Good, she said. Don't stop. No matter how hard it gets. She didn't explain why. She just left a $10 tip on a $6 meal and walked out like she hadn't just thrown me a lifeline. That night, I stayed up studying until the sun came up. I didn't understand everything, but I understood enough to realize that giving up would be the easy way out. And nothing about my life so far had ever been easy. The next week, I went to office hours. That professor, his name was Dr. Patel, I finally remembered, was surprised to see me. He asked what I was struggling with. I told him everything. He didn't laugh. He didn't shrug me off. He sat down next to me and walked through the problems one by one. And for the first time since I got there, I felt like someone actually wanted me to succeed. Still, the doubt lingered. Every time I saw a group of students laughing on the quad or overheard someone on the phone with their parents planning a weekend visit, I felt like I was on the outside looking in, like I was living a life parallel to theirs, but never quite intersecting. My parents hadn't called once. Mike sent a text once, a picture of his new truck, and a caption that said, "On the road again." I sent a thumbs up. That was it. The days started to blur together. Class, work, study, sleep, repeat. But slowly, something began to shift. I stopped worrying so much about how I looked, or whether I belonged. I started sitting closer to the front of the class. I raised my hand once, then twice. I answered questions. I got another quiz back, this time with a B-. It felt like winning the lottery. One night, after a particularly brutal double shift, I stood in front of the mirror in my apartment's tiny bathroom, splashed water on my face, and looked at myself. Not just at the dark circles or the faded hoodie or the chipped nail polish, but at my eyes. They looked different, sharper, stronger, like I'd finally started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could make it through this. And just as I turned to grab my towel, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was an email from Dr. Patel. Subject line, research opportunity, let's talk. I stared at it, heart pounding, hands shaking, and for the first time since I'd left home, I didn't feel scared. I felt ready. The email sat unopened in my inbox for almost 2 days, not because I didn't care, not because I was too busy, though the hours I worked and the chapters I crammed into every sleepless night could have justified that, but because I was afraid that what waited inside might demand more from me than I had left to give. It wasn't that I doubted Dr. Patel's sincerity. He wasn't the kind of professor who said things he didn't mean. But that subject line, research opportunity, let's talk, was like a key dangling just out of reach, one that might unlock a door I wasn't sure I was brave enough to walk through. It took everything I had just to keep the basics of my life from falling apart. Rent paid with tip money and calloused hands, homework scribbled on the back of diner receipts, textbooks rented instead of bought, and hours of sleep traded for hours of work no one ever thanked me for. But even as I tried to convince myself that maybe I should ignore it, pretend I hadn't seen it, something deeper, quieter, older, maybe even angrier, started whispering that this might be the moment I'd been crawling toward since the day I drove away from home without saying goodbye. When I finally opened the message, it was short and direct, the way Dr. Patel always was. A paragraph inviting me to join a pilot study on agricultural sustainability, a mention of a small stipend, access to graduate-level lab equipment, and most importantly, a chance to co-author a paper, something that, in his words, could open doors most undergrads never get close to. I read it 3 times, closed my laptop, paced the room, reopened it, and read it again. Then I typed the words, "I would be honored," and hit send before I could think too hard about it and lose my nerve. The following week was a blur of new routines layered on top of old ones, and the weight of them pressed into me like bricks stacked on my shoulders. Mornings started even earlier, evenings ran later, and by the time I clocked out of the diner and walked home past the gas station where I sometimes picked up expired sandwiches for half price, My legs ached so badly I often had to sit down on the curb before I could keep moving. But something had changed in me. The exhaustion was still there, but it came with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since high school. The kind of drive that burns behind your eyes even when your body wants to quit. The kind that whispers, one more page, one more hour, one more step. Dr. Patel introduced me to a graduate student named Tina, who had a sharp laugh, an encyclopedic knowledge of soil bacteria, and a no-nonsense attitude that I liked immediately. She didn't care where I came from or how many shifts I worked. She cared whether I showed up, asked the right questions, and did the work. And I did. I stayed late in the lab, running data through programs I barely understood, taking notes in a second-hand notebook with pages that curled at the corners, learning the names of enzymes and compounds and how small changes in pH could shift entire ecosystems. I loved it, not in the easy, romanticized way you love something new and exciting, but in the gritty, stubborn way you love something that challenges you, something that makes you earn every inch of progress. Mike called one night while I was sorting samples. It was the first time I'd heard from him in weeks. His voice sounded tired, different, less cocky, more grounded. He told me his route had changed, that he was driving longer hours for less pay, and that the job wasn't exactly what he thought it would be. I asked if he was okay. He said he wasn't sure. I almost told him about the research project, about how things were finally starting to feel like they made sense, but something stopped me. Maybe I didn't want to hear that same old silence on the other end of the line, or maybe I wasn't ready to let my family into the parts of my life they'd so easily dismissed. So instead I listened. I told him to stay safe. We hung up without saying much more than that, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a competition. It just felt like two siblings trying to survive in different ways. A few days later, I got a text from Mom. It was short and awkward. "How are you?" No punctuation, no emojis, no photos of the dog or updates about Dad. Just that. I stared at it for a long time before replying. "I'm fine. Busy with school." She didn't respond. I didn't expect her to. It was the first time she'd reached out since I left, and even though it didn't fix anything, it cracked something open. A small, uneven line in the solid wall I'd built between us. By the end of the semester, I had co-authored the research summary and submitted it to the State Undergraduate Science Symposium. Dr. Patel told me he was proud of the work I'd done. Tina said I'd made real contributions. I didn't know what to say. No one had used that word, proud, in my direction in years. I nodded, awkward and unsure, and thanked them both. I sent a copy of the research summary to my parents. No cover letter, no explanation, just the title and my name printed clearly at the top. I don't know if they read it. I don't know if they even opened the envelope, but it felt like something I needed to do, not for them, but for me. The next morning, I found a note taped to my locker at the diner. Written in a rushed, unfamiliar scrawl, it read, "Saw your name in the paper. College girl makes it big in science," or something like that. "You're doing good. Don't stop now." I never figured out who left it, but I folded it neatly and kept it in my wallet. And then, just as the semester ended and I thought I might have a second to breathe, another email arrived. This time from the State University's conference committee. "Your paper has been accepted. We'd love to see you present it next month." The subject line read, "Congratulations." My hands trembled as I read it, not from fear or disbelief, but from something harder to name, something like defiance and gratitude, and the quiet, relentless fire that only grows stronger when you've spent your whole life being told you couldn't. I closed my laptop, leaned back in the chair, and laughed, low and quiet and real. And for the first time since I left home, I felt something that almost resembled joy. The train ride to the state conference was long and uneventful. The kind of ride where the rhythm of the tracks and the sway of the cabin lull you into a half-sleep that isn't restful, just quiet. The kind of quiet you only realize you've been craving once it wraps itself around you completely. I sat by the window, a secondhand blazer folded neatly in my lap, a manila folder tucked under my arm, with 3 printed copies of my research summary inside, and a pit growing steadily in my stomach as the gray sprawl of cities gave way to the rolling, indifferent Midwest landscape. I had never been to a conference, never spoken publicly outside of a classroom, never stood behind a podium and tried to sound like I deserved to be there. But Dr. Patel had insisted I go, had even arranged the accommodations himself, said it would be good for my resume, for future graduate applications, and maybe most importantly, for me. I didn't have the heart to tell him that part of me still felt like I was playing dress up, like at any moment someone would notice I didn't belong, didn't come from the right neighborhood, didn't have the right kind of voice or upbringing or last name. The hotel was bigger than any place I'd ever stayed in, with high ceilings and an echo that followed you through the hallways. Every footstep a reminder that you were somewhere important, or at least trying to be. My room had 2 twin beds and a view of a parking lot, but to me it might as well have been a palace. I hung my blazer in the tiny closet, laid out my papers on the desk, and tried not to think about the fact that just 3 years earlier, I had been cleaning up after truckers in a diner and begging professors not to drop me for attendance violations. Now I was expected to present original research on sustainable soil microbiology to a room full of strangers who, unlike me, likely hadn't grown up being told that college was a waste of time or that life was about survival, not discovery. The morning of the presentation, I woke up before my alarm. I stood in the shower for 15 minutes, just letting the water hit me, not because I needed to, but because I didn't want to move too quickly and risk collapsing the fragile calm I'd built around myself. I stared at my reflection for a long time. No makeup, hair tied back, dark blazer over a white blouse that Tina had loaned me, slacks I'd found at a thrift store for $8 and had hemmed by hand. I looked serious, maybe even confident from the outside, but on the inside, I was unraveling one breath at a time. The room they assigned me was smaller than I expected, but still intimidating. There were rows of folding chairs filled with faces that looked both curious and unimpressed. And the moment I stepped to the podium, the air changed, quiet, expectant, heavy. I started with my name, my school, and the title of my paper, and for a moment, I could hear the tremble in my own voice like it belonged to someone else. But as I moved through the slides, as I explained the experimental process, the unexpected results, the implications for low-income agricultural communities, something shifted. My voice evened out. My hands stopped shaking, and when I finished the final sentence and looked up, there was silence. Not the bad kind, not the confused kind, but the kind that settles in when people are thinking, when they've actually listened. One of the professors in the audience raised his hand and asked a question, something technical, something about nitrogen levels and root systems. And I answered him clearly, precisely, and without hesitation. He nodded, another hand went up, then another, and before I knew it, I was in the middle of a real academic discussion. Not just holding my own, but leading it. When the moderator called time, I stepped back from the podium, and there was applause. Not loud, not wild, but honest. Tina found me outside the room 10 minutes later, coffee in one hand, a wide grin on her face, and told me I'd crushed it. I wanted to believe her, but it wasn't until a woman from an environmental nonprofit approached me later that afternoon and asked if I'd be interested in applying for an entry-level research position after graduation that it really hit me. Someone wanted to pay me to keep doing this, to keep thinking, keep questioning, keep proving that I could make a difference. I said I'd think about it, but inside, I was already planning how to draft my resume. That night, back in the hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and called Mike. He answered on the second ring, his voice tired but calm. I told him about the presentation, the questions, the job offer. There was a pause, long and heavy. Then he said, "That's real impressive, sis. Seriously." I didn't expect it. I didn't know what to say. We sat in silence for a few moments, the kind that feels like more than just distance. Then he added, "You ever think about coming home?" I laughed, not cruelly, but with a kind of bittersweet disbelief. "I don't think they'd even recognize me," I said. And I meant it. When I returned to campus, the dean's office sent me a letter of commendation, which I taped to the wall above my desk, right next to the note from the diner locker and a copy of my original failed math quiz. I looked at them every morning before class, a reminder of how far I'd come, how many times I'd almost quit, and how many times I didn't. I didn't send any of it to my parents. Not the photos, not the write-up in the university newsletter, not even the job offer that had been formalized and waiting for my signature. But I knew they'd hear about it eventually. Small towns always find a way to keep track of their own, even when they pretend not to care. The real moment, though, the one I kept replaying in my mind, wasn't the applause or the job offer or even the professor's nod of approval. It was the way people had looked at me during that presentation, not as a waitress or a dropout or a girl with a chip on her shoulder, but as a professional, a researcher, someone with something to say and the ability to back it up. And for the first time since I left, I started to believe that maybe I wasn't just proving something to them. Maybe I was proving something to myself. The morning of graduation arrived, not with the cinematic swell of music or the rush of adrenaline I'd quietly anticipated all those months of pushing through. Exhaustion and doubt, but with a dull, overcast sky and a quiet so thick I could almost taste it, like the universe had intentionally muted the world just to make sure I could hear every last thought rattling around in my own head. My alarm went off at 5:30, though I hadn't really slept. I had spent most of the night laying in bed with my eyes open, watching shadows crawl slowly across the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside my apartment window, replaying every moment, every insult swallowed, every silent walk to the bus stop, every night scrubbing floors at the diner while my hands cracked from bleach and cold water, and wondering, as I had 1,000 times before, if this day would actually feel like something, or if I'd still feel like the same girl they told to get a job and stop dreaming so damn big. I dressed slowly, methodically, as if putting on armor rather than a cap and gown. The robe hung awkwardly on my shoulders, and the cap, despite my best efforts to pin it down, wobbled slightly every time I moved, but I didn't care. I looked in the mirror, really looked, and what I saw wasn't a girl from a small town trying to prove a point anymore. I saw someone who had built herself from scraps, from rejection and quiet rage, from hours spent in labs no one ever saw, and nights spent staring at ceilings in rooms that never felt like home. I didn't wear makeup, didn't curl my hair or dress it up with any flourish. I wanted to walk across that stage exactly as I was, unfiltered, unpolished, and completely unrecognizable to the version of me that had once quietly packed a car before dawn and drove away without a word. The ceremony was held at the university arena, a space too large to feel personal, but too crowded to feel anonymous. And as I stood in line with the other graduates, adjusting my tassel and holding onto the folded piece of paper with my name and degree on it, I felt my chest tighten, not with fear, but with anticipation so dense it almost ached. My name would be called. My feet would move, and they would be there. I hadn't invited them directly. I never sent the RSVP cards or asked for tickets, never called to explain how to get there or where to park. But I had mentioned the date in one of the short, sterile text messages I sometimes exchanged with my mom, and I knew how things worked in a place like ours, where neighbors talk and word gets around, where pride can be denied at the dinner table but never entirely erased in public. If they came, it would be for themselves, and I was fine with that. I spotted them just as the procession began, seated on the far right a few rows up, looking slightly out of place among the sea of polished families with flowers and balloons and cameras that never stopped recording. Dad wore his usual denim jacket and baseball cap, a stiff posture betraying nerves he'd never admit to, while Mom sat beside him, scanning the graduates with a squint, probably hoping she'd recognize me before the name came, before the shame of not knowing her own daughter's face caught up to her. Mike wasn't there. I wasn't surprised. He'd texted the night before to say he couldn't get the time off, but that he was proud of me, and while it hurt, I appreciated the honesty. It felt cleaner than their silence. When my rouse stood and began the slow shuffle toward the stage, my hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. Instead, there was a strange calm, like the kind that settles in right before a storm breaks. A calm that made every sound in the arena fade beneath the steady thump of my own footsteps. I didn't look toward them as I walked. I kept my eyes forward, chin high, diploma card clutched tight. As the dean stepped to the microphone and read aloud, Lauren Elise Brooks, Bachelor of Science in Environmental Biology, summa cum laude, there was a brief moment of silence, just a breath, barely more than a pause, before the applause started. And that's when I saw it, the confusion on my mother's face as she whispered something to my father, the slow tilt of her head as she leaned forward, her eyes narrowing, mouth slightly parted as if seeing me for the first time. Not the girl who didn't call, not the daughter who walked away, but a stranger in a gown with a name she hadn't expected to hear through stadium speakers. My father stiffened further, his jaw tight, his hands clenching into slow fists on his knees. There was no smile, no nod, just stunned silence. I took my diploma, shook the dean's hand, posed for the photo I'd never buy, and stepped off the stage with my eyes fixed forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a glance or a smile, or even the acknowledgement of their presence. I walked straight past their row, back held straight as steel, and for a brief second, I felt the air shift, the unmistakable pull of a gaze too heavy to ignore, but I didn't turn around. I had given enough of myself to their expectations, their judgments, their invisible scoreboard, where Mike had always come out ahead. Today wasn't theirs. Outside, the sun had finally broken through the clouds, and the courtyard buzzed with laughter and flashes of phone cameras, families hugging, students crying, flowers exchanged like medals. I stood to the side, away from the noise, clutching my diploma like it might disappear if I let go, and waited, not for them, not for anyone, but just long enough to see if they'd come out. And they did. They stood just beyond the doors, scanning the crowd, Mom shielding her eyes from the glare, Dad with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. When her eyes finally found me, she took a step forward. My name slipped from her lips, hesitant, hopeful, maybe even proud. But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just looked at her, long and hard, until she stopped walking. There was so much I wanted to say, so many versions of I told you so that had burned on my tongue for years, but in the end, I didn't say anything. I just gave the smallest nod, turned my back, and walked away, the weight of the moment heavier than any suitcase I'd ever packed. And yet somehow, for the first time in years, I felt light. They could call, they could write, they could wonder, but they would never again doubt that I had been worth listening to all along.